What makes a piece of art good? What makes it bad? What makes it art to begin with? Can we prove any of that? I won't be answering any of these questions because trying to makes my head hurt, but I will talk a bit more about the branch of philosophy that aims to answer these questions. Aesthetics is a branch of philosophy that seeks to answer questions about, among many other topics, the nature of art, beauty, preference, and the value that we ascribe to those traits. Philosophers analyze objects and their traits to try and determine what might make them more or less appealing, as well as how people react to them emotionally and mentally. This leads to a couple of problems, though. Can we isolate just a single feature or quality that all aesthetic objects share? Or do aesthetic objects just have some similarities between each other? Where does an aesthetic property come from? The object itself or the perception of that object? Can we empirically prove that something is beautiful or not? Everyone has different preferences. Can you have a wrong preference? The answer to all of those questions is we don't really know. But a lot of people have spent a lot of time arguing about it, and I'm not smart enough to understand what they're talking about. Instead, let's focus on aesthetics in art and what makes art aesthetically pleasing or not that. First off, what even is art? There's two main approaches that seek to answer this question: essentialism and conventionalism. Essentialism is the idea that there's an essence or intrinsic property of artworks that make them art. Plato argued that artworks are representations that seek to depict or reflect reality in some way. Others have argued that an object is art if it was designed to evoke aesthetic experiences or pleasure. Conventionalists, on the other hand, argue that art is a social construct and that is defined by social or cultural agreements and conventions, which are naturally subject to change. For instance, something like, I don't know, a urinal could be considered art if societal conventions said so. But that would be crazy, right? No one would ever consider a urinal art, right? Oh. If you ask me, art is probably socially and culturally defined, but I think it's also personally defined. We're all exposed to objects and sounds constantly throughout the day, and even if we don't consciously think about them, we can still have emotional reactions to them and, regardless of how the rest of society looks at them, find value or meaning with them. You get to decide for yourself what art is, and no one can really take that away from you. One piece we went over in class was a composition by Tom Johnson titled Failing. The piece was interesting to me for several reasons. The piece is written for solo string bass and voice, in which the performer has to read a script and sheet music at the same time. This is a difficult task in its own right, but the music also progressively gets more difficult until the script cuts off and the performer is left to improvise the rest of the script while continuing to read the music. Failing reminded me of another piece called Vexations by Eric Satie. The piece itself is quite short, consisting of only a theme that's played first unaccompanied and then with chords above it. But it contains an author's note that reads, in order to play the motif 840 times in succession, it would be advisable to prepare oneself beforehand, and in the deepest silence, by serious immobilities. Both of these pieces highlight an interesting, self-referential relationship between the composer and the performer. Failing is a piece that was designed to be messed up. The composer relies on the performer to convey an aspect of the piece that cannot exist without the performance. Vexation, similarly, simply includes an author's note that suggests that the performer might play the piece 840 times without pause, but that fundamentally shifted how the piece is performed to this day. For my piece, I wanted to compose a solo piece for piano, but then I remembered that I can't really compose. So I'll just talk about the concept a bit. I'd like to write a solo piano piece that contains lyrics, both written down and improvised. The idea is that some sections of the piece would contain written lyrics that ask questions and prompts of the performer, like, how are you, or what are you afraid of? And in the following sections without lyrics, the performer would respond earnestly, either in time with the piece or in free time, depending on the preference of the performer. I think this captures some of the ideas that Tom Johnson and Satie had while they wrote their pieces. My piece, like Failing, would depend on the performer to execute one of the fundamental aspects of the music, as well as giving the performer space to speak genuinely about their experience. Like Vexations, it would not ever tell the performer how to perform the piece, but guide and shape the performance through suggestions or prompts. Anyways, thank you for watching.